What if one of the biggest attacks on a major energy power in modern history is happening right now, and the global oil market barely seems to care? That sounds impossible. For decades, every major disruption involving one of the world's largest energy producers has followed a familiar pattern. Pipelines are damaged, export terminals are threatened, or production is interrupted and oil prices immediately surge. Markets have learned to price geopolitical risk almost instantly. But according to publicly available reports, something very different appears to be unfolding during the latest phase of the Russia-Ukraine war. Over just a few nights in early July, Ukrainian long-range drone units reportedly struck dozens of electrical substations across occupied Crimea and other Russian-controlled territories. At the same time, additional drone attacks reached deep inside Russia itself, targeting major oil refining infrastructure hundreds of kilometers from the front line. If these assessments are accurate, this represents one of the broadest coordinated attacks on Russia's domestic energy network since the full scale invasion began. Yet Brent crude has remained near its slowest levels in months. So why isn't the market reacting? The answer reveals something important not only about modern warfare, but also about how today's global energy system actually works. Because despite appearances, not every attack on energy infrastructure affects the oil market in the same way. To understand why, we first need to look at the nature of Ukraine's campaign. Unlike many earlier drone operations that focused on symbolic military targets, recent strikes appear to follow a much more systematic pattern. Instead of aiming at isolated facilities, analysts believe Ukraine has increasingly concentrated on the supporting infrastructure that allows Russia's military and economy to function every day. Electric substations, power transmission hubs, fuel storage facilities, oil refineries. Each target may seem relatively ordinary on its own. Together, however, they form an interconnected network that keeps both civilian industry and military logistics operating. Open-source satellite imagery appears to support this assessment. Thermal hotspots recorded after several reported strikes corresponded with fires at high-voltage electrical substations across occupied Crimea. Independent analysts comparing nighttime satellite imagery have also pointed to noticeable reductions in electrical illumination across portions of the peninsula compared with the same period a year earlier. While such imagery cannot by itself determine the exact cause of every outage, it provides a useful indicator of changing infrastructure conditions over time. That matters because electricity is one of the least visible but most essential components of military power. Without reliable electrical supply, communications degrade, rail systems become less efficient, industrial production slows, repair facilities lose capacity, fuel distribution becomes more difficult. Even sophisticated air-defense networks depend on stable power and communications infrastructure. Modern warfare is not only about destroying combat units. Increasingly, it is about reducing an opponent's ability to sustain military operations over weeks and months. That appears to be one of the strategic objectives behind Ukraine's expanding long-range drone campaign. But the electrical grid represents only half of this story, because during the same week that substations across occupied territory were reportedly coming under attack, another set of targets arguably even more significant was burning deep inside Russia itself. And those targets reveal why this campaign could have consequences extending far beyond the battlefield. To understand the logic behind Ukraine's latest strikes, it's important to distinguish between two parts of the energy industry that are often treated as if they were the same. They are not. One produces crude oil. The other transforms crude into usable fuel. That distinction explains almost everything. According to publicly available reports, one of the most significant strikes during the first week of July targeted the Lukoil refinery in Kyiv, located in Russia's Nizhny Novgorod region, hundreds of kilometers east of Moscow. The facility has long ranked among Russia's largest refineries, processing millions of tons of crude every year and supplying gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel to domestic markets. Open-source reports indicate that processing units at the refinery were damaged, forcing another disruption after previous attacks had already affected operations earlier in the year. Only days later, Ukrainian long-range drones reportedly reached an even more ambitious target. For perhaps the first time on this scale, drones penetrated deep into the Leningrad region, striking facilities connected to the St. Petersburg oil terminal as well as infrastructure near Vysotsk, one of Russia's major Baltic energy hubs. If accurate, these flights covered roughly 900 kilometers, demonstrating that Ukraine's growing fleet of long-range drones is no longer confined to areas close to the front. From a military perspective, that distance may be more significant than the physical damage itself. Range changes strategy. Once a weapon can reliably reach targets hundreds of kilometers inside an adversary's territory, Planners gain far more flexibility in choosing where and when to apply pressure. Instead of reacting to Russian operations near the battlefield, Ukraine can increasingly threaten critical infrastructure supporting military operations across the entire western portion of Russia. That forces Moscow to defend a vastly larger geographic area. Air-minus defense systems become dispersed. Radar coverage must expand. Interceptor missiles are consumed protecting facilities that previously faced little risk. In military planning, forcing an opponent to defend everywhere often produces greater strategic value than attacking any single location. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of this campaign is what Ukraine has not been targeting. There have been relatively few reported attempts to strike Russia's producing oil fields. Instead, the emphasis has remained on refineries, storage facilities, electrical substations, and logistics infrastructure. That choice is likely deliberate. Oil fields are difficult to disable permanently. Production wells can often resume operations after repairs, and many are geographically dispersed across enormous regions. Refineries are different. They contain highly specialized processing equipment, catalytic units, compressors, and control systems that are expensive, technically complex, and in some cases difficult to replace under sanctions. Even relatively limited damage can reduce output for weeks or even months depending on which components are affected. Military analysts often describe this as attacking the system's processing capacity rather than its resource base. Russia may still produce roughly the same amount of crude oil, but if it cannot efficiently convert that crude into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and lubricants, the consequences are felt throughout the domestic economy. According to several energy analysts, Russia has experienced recurring regional fuel shortages following repeated refinery attacks, prompting temporary export restrictions and localized rationing measures in certain areas. If those reports accurately reflect broader trends, the pressure is not being created by a lack of oil. It is being created by a shortage of refined fuel where it is needed most. For any military, fuel is as essential as ammunition. Armored vehicles cannot maneuver. Aircraft cannot sustain sortie rates. Logistics convoys slow. Training schedules are disrupted. Even civilian transportation competes with military demand during periods of limited supply. In other words, Ukraine's campaign appears designed less to destroy Russia's energy wealth than to complicate Russia's ability to convert that wealth into operational military capability. And yet, despite this growing pressure on Russia's domestic fuel system, global oil prices have remained surprisingly stable. That apparent contradiction is exactly where the story becomes even more interesting. Because what matters to Russian motorists and what matters to global energy markets are not necessarily the same thing. At first glance, the numbers simply do not make sense. Russia is one of the world's largest energy producers. According to publicly available reports, multiple refineries have suffered repeated drone attacks. Electrical infrastructure has been disrupted across occupied territories, and portions of Russia's domestic fuel network continue operating under increasing strain. Under normal circumstances, markets would interpret that as a major supply risk. Oil prices would be expected to rise. Instead, they have moved in the opposite direction. During early July, Brent crude remained near its lowest levels in several months. For many observers, that seems completely disconnected from events unfolding on the battlefield. The explanation lies in one of the most misunderstood aspects of the energy business. Crude oil is not the same product as gasoline. Destroying a refinery does not necessarily reduce the amount of crude oil available to the world. It reduces a country's ability to process that crude into finished fuels. That distinction matters enormously. If a refinery is damaged, Russia may temporarily lose the capacity to produce gasoline or diesel for domestic consumption, but the crude oil itself still exists. Unless production wells are shut down, those barrels can often be redirected elsewhere. In fact, analysts have noted that when domestic refining capacity falls, producers may actually increase crude exports rather than leave production idle. From the perspective of global oil markets, additional crude entering international trade can actually place downward pressure on prices instead of pushing them higher. It is one of the rare situations where successful attacks on energy infrastructure do not automatically translate into higher global energy costs. Another factor has little to do with Russia at all. The geopolitical risk premium that dominated markets earlier in the year has gradually faded. Following the easing of tensions around the Strait of Hormuz, commercial shipping resumed through one of the world's most important maritime choke points. That alone removed a significant amount of uncertainty that had previously been priced into every barrel of oil. At roughly the same time, several major producers increased supply. According to publicly available production data, Members of OPEC approved additional output increases as concerns about immediate regional disruption declined. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates also restored higher export volumes after earlier interruptions. More supply combined with lower perceived geopolitical risk generally produces one outcome: lower prices. That broader market trend has outweighed the effects of Ukraine's refinery campaign for now. Meanwhile, Russia has continued exporting large volumes of crude. China remains one of Moscow's largest energy customers. India has also continued purchasing discounted Russian oil despite ongoing Western sanctions. These buyers are purchasing crude oil, not refined gasoline. As long as export routes remain open, Russia continues generating substantial revenue from international energy sales, even while parts of its domestic refining network face repeated disruptions. That creates an unusual strategic split. Ukraine is successfully increasing pressure inside Russia. Drivers may encounter fuel shortages. Regional authorities may struggle with distribution. Military logistics become more complicated. Yet the financial lifeline generated by crude exports has not been severed to the same extent. From a strategic standpoint, these are two very different objectives. One targets Russia's internal operational capacity. The other targets its long-term ability to finance the war. At the moment, Ukraine appears to be concentrating primarily on the first, but there are signs that the second may eventually become more relevant. Several recent strikes reportedly occurred near facilities connected not only to refining operations but also to export infrastructure in Russia's Baltic region. If those assessments are accurate, it could indicate that Ukrainian planners are gradually expanding the range of potential target sets. That possibility deserves close attention, because attacking export terminals represents an entirely different level of economic pressure. Unlike refineries, export terminals directly affect the movement of crude into global markets. If enough export capacity were interrupted, the consequences would extend far beyond Russia's borders. And that is the point where today's relatively calm energy markets could begin reacting very differently. So where does this campaign go from here? At the time of writing, Ukraine has demonstrated something that many military analysts considered difficult only a few years ago. It has shown the ability to conduct sustained long-range drone operations against one of the world's largest energy infrastructures. This is no longer about a handful of symbolic attacks. According to publicly available reports, strikes have reached electrical substations, refinery complexes, storage facilities, logistics hubs, and infrastructure located hundreds of kilometers from the front line. More importantly, they have occurred repeatedly. That consistency is what transforms individual drone strikes into a military campaign. The objective is not necessarily to destroy every target permanently. Instead, it is to force Russia into a continuous cycle of repair, air defense deployment, resource allocation, and industrial recovery. Every damaged transformer requires replacement. Every refinery shutdown interrupts production schedules. Every successful interception still consumes expensive air-minus defense missiles. Radar coverage, maintenance crews, and personnel. In military planning, this is known as imposing costs on an opponent. Even attacks that produce relatively limited physical damage can become strategically valuable if they repeatedly force the defender to spend more resources than the attacker. That equation strongly favors inexpensive unmanned systems. A drone costing tens of thousands of dollars can force the launch of interceptor missiles worth several $million. It can also temporarily halt industrial operations that generate billions in annual revenue. Over time, that cost imbalance becomes increasingly significant. However, there is another side to this strategy. So far, much of Ukraine's campaign has focused on infrastructure that supports Russia's domestic fuel system. While this creates real logistical and economic challenges inside Russia, it does not necessarily remove large volumes of crude oil from global markets. That distinction explains why international energy prices have remained relatively stable despite the visible damage. The situation changes dramatically if export infrastructure becomes the primary target. Russia exports much of its crude through a relatively limited number of major ports on the Baltic and Black Seas. Facilities such as Primorsk, Ust-Luga, and Novorossiysk serve as critical gateways connecting Russian production to buyers in Asia and elsewhere. If significant portions of that export network were disrupted, the effects would no longer remain largely domestic. Global supply expectations would immediately change. Energy traders would begin pricing at export uncertainty rather than simply refinery damage. That is the scenario capable of moving international oil prices much more aggressively. Whether Ukraine intends to expand its targeting priorities remains uncertain. Publicly available information does not provide definitive evidence of such a shift. but recent strikes near export miners-related facilities suggest that analysts will be watching future operations very closely. The strategic implications extend beyond this war. Modern conflicts increasingly demonstrate that infrastructure has become a battlefield in its own right. Power grids, communications networks, transportation hubs, ports, fuel depots, and industrial facilities now influence military effectiveness almost as much as traditional battlefield victories. Precision drones have accelerated that trend. Instead of concentrating overwhelming firepower against frontline formations, militaries can increasingly attack the systems that allow those formations to operate in the first place. The result is a gradual shift in how wars are fought. Success is measured not only by territory captured, but by the ability to sustain logistics, energy production, industrial output, and economic resilience over months or years. For governments around the world, this conflict offers an important warning. Critical infrastructure can no longer be viewed solely as civilian assets. They have become strategic targets. Protecting electrical grids, fuel distribution networks, ports, and industrial facilities is becoming just as important as expanding conventional military forces. Ultimately, Ukraine's drone campaign illustrates both the strengths and the limits of modern long-range precision warfare. It has proven remarkably effective at increasing Russia's operational costs and complicating domestic logistics. Yet it has also highlighted an important economic reality. Damaging refineries is not the same as removing crude oil from global supply. As long as export routes remain functional and international buyers continue purchasing Russian crude, Moscow retains a significant source of wartime revenue. That is why the next phase of this campaign could prove far more consequential than the last. The drones have already demonstrated the necessary range. The technology has already proven itself. The remaining question is one of strategic intent. Will future operations continue focusing on Russia's internal fuel network? Or will they increasingly target the export infrastructure that connects Russian oil to the global economy? The answer to that question will influence not only the trajectory of the war, but potentially global energy markets, inflation, and economic stability far beyond Eastern Europe. And that is why these drone strikes are about much more than explosions captured on satellite imagery. They represent a test of whether modern precision warfare can systematically erode the economic foundations of a major military power, one infrastructure node at a time.